in this particular part, we now focus on varying levels of aggression which create shifts inside our DCS. You see, in the previous parts, we taught you our proprietary DCS system which uses parallel lines or channel lines. But the reality is, different levels of aggression by either the buyer or the seller can create or shift the lines of our DCS. What this means is that your upper line of the DCS can compress lower because of a more aggressive seller, or the lower line of your DCS can compress higher due to an or a more aggressive buyer. Either way, shifts in the aggression of either buyer or seller still represent the same spirit of profit taking inside our DCS, or which is meant to be captured by our DCS. Let me now show you some examples of how these shifts in aggression can manifest in our DCS channel or our DCS approach. First, let's look at a typical zigzag, which is bounded by our DCS approach. When you have a more than aggressive or more than usual aggressive buyer, your DCS simply turns into a pattern that classical technicians call a falling wedge. In the same way that if you have a more than aggressive seller, the pattern or the DCS shifts into a DCS that is also a falling wedge pattern. Now, when you have both aggressive buyers and sellers, that DCS also shifts into a falling wedge pattern. Either way, when you have varying levels of aggression inside a zigzag, it doesn't change the fact on how we operate or apply our E framework. This means that inside a falling wedge, you still can apply your E1 entry or your aggressive entry, your E2 entry or your neutral entry, or your E3 entry, which is the more conservative entry. Now let's take a look inside flat patterns bounded by our DCS. You see, even inside flats, we also find varying levels of aggression. What that means is when you have a more than aggressive buyer, what happens is that you eventually come up with a pattern that classical technicians call an ascending triangle. In the same way that if you have a more than aggressive or a more than usual aggressive seller, you come up with a pattern that classical technicians call a descending triangle. Historically, descending triangles have actually also been found as bullish continuation patterns, albeit less frequent. Now, the last pattern that manifests when you have varying levels of aggression by both buyers and sellers is what we call, or what classical technicians call, the symmetrical triangle. This happens to your DCS when you have both more than usual aggressive buyers and sellers. All in all, whether we have ascending triangles, descending triangles, or symmetrical triangles which reflect varying levels of aggressiveness by both buyers and sellers, our E framework still applies. That means that inside these patterns, we still can apply our E1 or our aggressive entry, our E2 or neutral entry, or our E3 conservative entry. So at this point, I'd like to clarify a very important distinction for triangles, and that is for triangles in particular, prices will always break out, or majority of the time, at the fourth test of resistance after an additional wind up. Also, as we have tried to simplify this as much as possible for this video, we will be discussing the differences in the fib structure during the next video between flats and triangles.